Welcome to the Rock Newman Show.
It's the Rock Newman Show.
I told you that we had a surprise guest. And, you know, let me set this up this way. That for decades and decades and decades and decades, within, in particular, the African-American community, but also in the historic preservation community, there's a place in the Big Easy, New Orleans, that Treme, the place, there's a neighborhood there. It's called Treme. You know, in New Orleans, they have those things. They say Treme and beignet. You know, it looks like beignet, but it's beignet. Well, Treme has, again, as I said, for decades been thought of as the oldest African-American neighborhood in the United States of America. And our next guest here has a little something to say about that. He's going to teach us a little bit today. And teaching is very much one of the many things he's qualified to do. I am talking about Morgan State University professor Dale Green. Professor Green, welcome to the Rock Newman Show. Okay, so we talk about Treme being the oldest African-American neighborhood in the United States. Now, recently, there were reports about the work that you've done, and for those of you who know, he heads up the Department of Architecture and Historical Preservation at Morgan State University. And someone's got to be really special to be on this show for Morgan State because, you know, we're Howard people over her. But Professor Green I found to be extremely fascinating. And he has some information that, first of all, I thought it should have been a lot bigger story than it was. It actually, I saw it in the Washington Post. But why don't we go, and let me just say, I don't want to steal any thunder, but there is a community in Maryland, on the eastern shore of Maryland, Talbot County, that we now understand that you and your team have been able to determine that predates as an African-American community, Treme,
yes,
by many years.
Yes.
What you say?
Yes. Well, we have been very fortunate to uncover in recent times what we now know to be America's oldest free black neighborhood that has been continuously occupied and inhabited for decades and decades and decades prior to Treme. Treme celebrated last year its bicentennial. So it was founded in 1812. The neighborhood that we've been working in and have had several archaeological excavations in has taken us back to the American Revolutionary War. This neighborhood was founded somewhere around 1770. So we have to be careful to say it's not the earliest African-American neighborhood. However, it is certainly the oldest African-American neighborhood. And what's important about that is that...
And you're saying free.
And free. There should be a strong emphasis on the fact that this was free.
And this is 1770.
This is 1770. And what largely gave rise to that was a very significant Quaker population in Maryland, and in particular in Talbot County going back to the 1600s. And it was the Quakers who were early in manumitting their slave population, because the Quakers did, in fact, own
Did you
slaves.
say manumitting?
Manumitting.
Manumitting?
Yes,
What's
freeing
that?
them.
I was going to say,
Absolutely.
what that mean?
Yeah, freeing them. And the Quakers did indeed own several slaves, and they owned a lot of them, and they were the first to, again, begin to emancipate
Just hold on.
them.
Give me that word again. What is it?
Manumissions, manumitting,
manumitting,
or emancipating them,
okay,
or freeing them.
I never heard that before.
All synonyms,
okay.
yes,
okay.
absolutely.
All right.
And so the Quakers were very extraordinary in that regards in terms of doing that. However, there were others that were also contributing to this.
Let me just ask you a question about that. That the Quakers owned slaves,
yes,
and then they were they started manumitting them. They started freeing them.
And let me tell you why they started doing that.
That's what I was going to ask. That's what I was going to ask.
There were two very influential Quakers who came on foot journeys, which essentially meant that they came down to Maryland's Eastern Shore from various places, including England. Mm-hmm. And they would walk through areas like Talbot County, which had a very robust slave population. And they would wear dye clothing, and they would wear this dye clothing because that clothing wasn't produced by slaves. So these were abolitionists who were serious. They walked the walk, they talked the talk, and they would talk to these Quaker meeting houses like Third Haven and Peach Blossom and what have you. And it took a couple years in order for this to take real effect. They came in 1740, and they came back in 1760. And it wasn't until 1770 that we actually began to see those records indicating that, in fact, these meeting houses were, in fact, freeing, manumitting, or emancipating that slave population. And so that's what gave rise to the Hill neighborhood, which is the name of this oldest African-American neighborhood that we've come to learn in the country here, which happens to be located in Maryland, which had the second largest free black population in the country in 1790. And so this area really constituted the largest free black population in the Chesapeake region. There were more free blacks in this neighborhood than there were in Baltimore. There were more free blacks densely populated in this neighborhood than there were slaves on the largest plantation in that area, which was the White House Plantation that owned Frederick Douglass. There were only 346 slaves on that plantation, and there were over 410 in the area in which we've uncovered this work. And so this has been something that's been well under the radar for, decades. However,
centuries.
We must say. Although there are those that live in the community who have lived there as free blacks going back all the way to 1790 when the United States had its first federal census and recorded white persons and black persons and what have you. Those records indicate these families, list their names. Those same families live in this neighborhood in 2013. And so nowhere else can we find that kind of longevity to a neighborhood without it being gentrified, obliterated, or what have you. And so,
is the Hill today still an African American community?
The Hill today is still a African American community.
So here's what I'm just baffled. I'm baffled by all of our learned behavior and all of our technology and all of our history and all of our, colleges.
Sure.
Why haven't we known this before? How did that go undiscovered? Something so obvious.
Sure, absolutely.
I mean, I was so excited about having you on this program, man, because I have a lot of questions to ask about this, and I'm fascinated by it. And one of the things, I have a dear friend in New Orleans. His name is Don Hubbard, and he owns the Hubbard Mansion on St. Charles Avenue, which is the first black-owned business there. So we often talk about and compare and compete. And I always like to have one up on him.
Yes.
Man, when I read this here and knew that you were coming on the show, Don Hubbard is watching right now. So we want to clearly establish beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Yes.
That the Hill.
That's right.
Significantly in years predates Treme.
That's correct.
Don Hubbard, this is for you.
That's right. That's correct.
How did it remain a secret?
Well, sure. There are two things that I often talk about with this. And one is I say that this has very much been a product of the story of disbelief. Many persons, whether white or black, would disbelieve that there would have been a neighborhood existing during the time that this existed of free blacks.
Yes.
And not just a pocket of a neighborhood where blacks were set aside to live, but some of the richest African-American families that were in the state of Maryland in 1790 lived in this community. There were free blacks like Joseph Chain, who was fluent in French, who had 5 businesses on Washington Street, which is a street that was, in fact, named after George Washington, as he commissioned.
What was his name?
This African-American's name was Joseph Chain. Chain like Chain.
Joseph Chain.
And he was a early founder of the community, as well as a early founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is there and the oldest on Maryland's Eastern Shore, and again, birthed in that particular community. And he had several businesses that range from grocery stores during that time where both whites and blacks purchased products from there. He also had a barber shop for which he served the white gentry. He did house calls to persons like Robert Goldsboro, who were of the Thomas Jefferson and George Washington caliber.
So let me ask you a question. So this is a free black man.
Yes.
And he's cutting the white people's hair, the gentry.
And selling them blades, which is really important back then.
And selling them blades.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
and persons like Johns Hopkins.
So some white people trusted this brother with that blade to sit in that chair.
Precisely.
Okay. All right.
Precisely.
Okay.
And so you had all of these things going on, and many of them lived beside some of the wealthy white persons that actually lived in and around the neighborhood. So this was very much, again, as I said, a story of disbelief, because if you come to the area, the architecture and the built environment still reflects the period of significance. And many persons would look at these houses and they'd say, well, black people didn't live in those houses. We still have that problem in 2013. When I give tours through the neighborhood and I point clearly at the structures that I know persons would doubt, they are so shocked to learn that African Americans lived in this stately brick federal period house from 1790, and that they in fact lived there for decades and decades and decades, and many of them still live in those same houses. Some have transitioned into white ownership or what have you, but these are the things that people disbelieve. The other thing that contributes to it is that I say often that there are two types of mentalities. There's a come here mentality, persons that move to an area from somewhere else, and then there's the from here mentality. And those are the persons that have been there, as I mentioned, from 1770 or the 1790s period. And this is all just an everyday experience to them. So
Ain't
it's
no
like,
big deal.
yeah, sure, this is the hill. This is where we live. You know,
Ain't no
we
thing.
didn't know it was
Chicken
America's
wing.
oldest or what have you. And exactly. And so with all of those things coupled together, we've overlooked this. We all have overlooked it. I've said often it's not just a black story, it's an American story.
It is.
This is a reflection of how whites and blacks work together. This place would have never existed if they hadn't have been patronized by the white community. This is how Christians and Quakers work together. This place would have never come into formation had it not been for the Quaker population. So again, I think the more we can talk about what united us versus what divided us, we can get closer to these chapters of our history, which have been yet to be written.
Yeah. Let me ask. So there was the hill.
There was the hill.
There were mamas and daddies.
Yes.
Which meant that babies were being born.
That's right.
Now, talk to me about what you know and understand about whether or not, I like something that comes to mind for me is, do we know who like the first formally trained doctor was? I'm sure there were midwives and babies being born, so babies were being born and somebody was there while they were being born.
Yes.
Now, do we have any information on that?
What an excellent question. I'm always honored to talk about, we call her Amazing Grace. Her name was Grace Brooks, and she was this individual that you're talking about. She was born in 1740, and in 1788, she does something very, very extraordinary, and in fact is one of the first in the country to do this. She emancipates herself, her children, and her grandchildren in one transaction for 70 pounds. In 1788, 70 years prior to the Emancipation Proclamation.
Okay, let me ask you. So it makes me think right away. Grace Brooks,
yes,
emancipated herself.
And her children. And her grandchildren.
Now, do you know if she was an offspring of a slave master, or do you have any idea of her parentage?
We do not, although it is very likely, based on how she's described and based on how she was perhaps brought up on the plantation in which she was enslaved.
Right.
It is very likely that she is a product of the slave master.
Because, I know there are a lot of Brookses out there.
Oh, absolutely.
And I asked that question because if you had told me she was like a very dark-skinned Brooks, my first girlfriend was a very dark-skinned Brooks. Her name was Ivia Brooks. And so probably not necessarily have that lineage there.
Maybe.
Not necessarily.
You never know.
We don't. And I'm telling you, what you're sharing with us today it certainly opens my eyes up, and I'm hoping that opens up the eyes of others. So please go on and tell me. She
So-
liberated herself and her children.
And her children and her grandchildren.
And her grandchildren.
And she did this for 70 pounds. So one question is, where does a African-American female who was a slave in 1788 and prior get 70 pounds, which is a substantial amount of money
yes.
in 1788? And doing this 70 years prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. And doing that 3 transactions in one. It was a big deal to emancipate yourself.
Right.
But to get your children and also to get your grandchildren is quite extraordinary, and not one record has surfaced for that ever happening in America. So she is probably the first person, regardless of color, who had ever done so. And she does that and moves into this community after she leaves the plantation. And by 1792...
moves into the community of the Hill.
The Hill. She purchases her own home as single head of her household. And that house is a house that still stands, for which persons can come and see. Wow. And it is fully documented. However, it had never had any attachments to her. So the history of that house has always been praised for its European architecture, if you will, and for being one of the oldest structures in the town of Easton, but never affiliated with this rich woman named Grace Brooks, who was a free African-American, who purchased her freedom, for which her records had always existed. No one knew about her. Her own descendants had no idea who she was.
Okay, so just, keeping it basic and going back, where did she get the 70 pounds? Is there a determination of that?
We have no records to support where she received the 70 pounds.
Okay.
Obviously, the records indicate and verify, in fact, that she paid the 70 pounds, so she certainly had it. But how she earned that money is unknown.
Okay, so then not so many years later, she moves into this...
She moves to the Hill.
To this grand home.
Precisely. And she's a midwife in the community.
I mean, because that's how we started. I was saying about the doctor.
Absolutely,
right.
absolutely. And she's serving the white and the black community. And she is very liked in the community. She, at her death in 1810, she is one of the first, again, women, not just black or white, but women to have an obituary. Women wouldn't have had an obituary, so to speak, in 1810. And she has a full-page obituary, which really helps us to understand who she was in the community and exactly what she did. She's likened in that obituary to Benjamin Banneker, who works with L'Enfant to lay out the plan of Washington, D.C., which didn't exist during the era that we're talking about all of this history.
Sure.
And she's likened to Phyllis Wheatley, who is one of the first African-American poets. And we're sitting down in the space of Langston Hughes.
Hello.
A later period. But she's also talked about as being of sable hue and not being black and not being dark and not being a Negro and what have you. So they talk about her in ways that are so eloquent and in ways that make her a human being for which other African Americans would not have been spoken of as such. And so she was quite a remarkable, and as I said, as she's often being referred to, a amazing grace. And so we are so privileged to have uncovered her legacy and to be able to share now with the world as we remember this place as the Hill.
As the Hill. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound.
Absolutely.
You're going to hear us when we come. We're going to hear our sound when we come back after these messages on the Rock Newman Show. We're with Professor Dale Green from the Architecture and Historic Preservation Department at Morgan State University. We'll be back in a moment.
drives a Pohanka.
The weekend is here, and no matter what the weather's like outside, you'll find the deals inside here in the beautiful showroom of the all-new Pohanka Hyundai in Capitol Heights during their giant Markdown Madness sale.
Smart shoppers know that every new Hyundai in Pohanka comes with Hyundai Assurance and America's best 10-year, 100,000-mile powertrain warranty. But why don't you tell them about the Markdown sale, Joe?
I'll be happy to, Kim. Folks, shop around on the web, and you'll see lease payments on a new 2013 Elantra GLS at $179 a month. Today at Pohanka Hyundai, $99 a month. That's right, a $99 payment on a brand new Elantra.
And $89 a month on a new 2013 Accent GLS Automatic. How do they do it, Joe?
It must be the volume, Kim. A brand new building, hundreds of new Hyundais, and Pohanka's low payment and easy credit programs are designed to get everybody driving. But you have to get here today. Rush to the giant Markdown Madness sale at exit 13 off the Capitol Beltway.
Pohanka Hyundai, king of the Beltway. All financing for a limited term on approved HMF credit.
My baby drives a Pohanka.
Hello to all my friends in the DMV. I am Rock Newman from the Rock Newman Show. I want to tell you about the MGM Grand National Harbor, the most exciting project to come to the District, Maryland, or Virginia in quite some time. You're going to have great fun. Come on down, support this project with all you have. It is going to be wonderful for the area. We're going to increase our tax base. We're going to get funding for the police department, for ambulance, for fire, for education. It is really a project that is going to benefit our area. Folks, we want to support in a very strong DMV kind of way this great project from the MGM Grand National Harbor.
And now, the Rock Newman Show.
Folks, we're back on the Rock Newman Show today, August the 10th, 2013, broadcasting live from Busboys and Poets at 14th V Street, Northwest Washington, D.C. My just absolutely fascinating guest, I said he's going to be a surprise guest. I really should have said fascinating, because he just has a fascinating story to share with us. And that is the I'm going to call it the latter day discovery of the oldest African American neighborhood in the country. And if my math is right, this is like 1770. We know that this community existed, and Tremay was 1812.
Yes.
Tremay, we know, dates back to 1812. So Don Hubbard, 42 years before you, bro, us folks up here in the DMV, DC, Maryland, and Virginia, had a neighborhood. Tell me, okay, so we're talking about Grace Brooks.
Yes.
And Grace was a midwife. She liberated herself. Again, by the way, this is Professor Dale Green from Morgan State University. Grace Brooks, midwife, liberated herself. What was her profession as we know it that of a midwife, or did she do other things also?
She did other things for which we are not able to really quite understand because there are no records for what exactly she did beyond being a midwife.
Right.
But one of the things that we're able to use to fill the gaps is archaeology. So part of our process and the historical research in terms of how we've been uncovering this rich story, in terms of using oral history, genealogy, land records, archaeology, and other historical records, the archaeology really fills the holes in the stories like this. When someone would ask, well, what else did Grace Brooks do? And we don't have documents that support that. We don't have oral history that can begin to speak to that. When we begin to excavate at that property where Grace Brooks lived, where we know that she lived there through land records, tax assessments, and etc., we can then find through the material culture and the artifacts that are uncovered, because the artifacts are always very richly preserved, less than 6 inches below the earth, all across the country, all across the cultural landscape, if you will.
Right.
And so we will begin to evaluate those artifacts and interpret them according to other material culture and historical documents that we have to begin to depict what exactly she was doing in addition to being a midwife.
Right.
So we haven't gotten to that point with Grace Brooks. We've been able to do that with some others in the neighborhood. We've just not gotten to her site yet to archaeologically excavate it. We plan to do that actually summer 2014.
Okay, just about her for a second. Her descendants
Yes.
exist?
Her descendants exist.
You're in touch with them?
They live in the community. They continue to go to the same church after 195 years. So they are very much alive. Many were not familiar with her at all. They had no idea who she was, or in fact that she was even an ancestor of theirs, or that anybody in their family had ever achieved anything of that level of significance. So this has been very exciting and very rewarding for those that, again, as I said, were the from-heres who didn't really understand how significant their neighborhood was, their legacy was, and what have you.
Well, let me tell you what the Rock Newman Show is going to do. And I can say this because I'm the executive producer of the Rock Newman Show, you see. The Rock Newman Show is going to come across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge into that area now that is just generally and commonly referred to
As Easton.
We're going to work something out where we come over there and we do a broadcast from there. Now, whether it's her house or some other point that galvanizes the community, here's what we'd like to do. We'd like to come over there and try to, in advance, identify as many of the descendants who trace back to the time of Grace Brooks and her contemporaries and have them in a room. That's what we want to do.
Well, I want you to do that.
All right.
That sounds great.
Well, I'm going to tell you just right now, and we're going to make a big deal about it. You know what? Because this is a story that's absolutely not just the Easton Maryland story,
That's right.
Eastern Shore of Maryland story, a DMV story.
That's right.
This is a national story. This is a national story.
This is a national to international story.
Yes.
There's another component. There's many components.
It absolutely is, because you talked about the Quakers coming in.
Well, there's another piece.
And the timing being around the Revolutionary War and all of that. And the Revolutionary War didn't happen because, there had something to do, the Boston Tea Party had something to do with taxation without representation.
That's right.
So that taxation with representation was coming from folks that was across the water.
Correct.
So there's the international component to this.
And there's a very known, documented international connection to Africa. So oftentimes we will just loosely talk about the slaves coming from Africa with no real record of exactly where they came from, who went and got them, exactly what ship they were on, and etc. And for Easton, and for this neighborhood in particular, by way of Jeremiah Banning, who was a sea captain and white, went to Senegal, Africa, handpicked his 21 slaves, brought them back to Easton.
Hold on,
and
1
today
second right
I
there.
have his log and will in his own handwriting recording who they were. So we know exactly who they were, where they were on the hill, and who their descendants are.
Folks,
and that's very
look,
rare.
look. Pardon me. Pardon me. I try to be humble, but I don't have enough humility not to say this. This is the kind of stuff you get on the Rock Newman Show. And when you come out here and have a wonderful breakfast at Busboys and Poets at 14th and V Street, Northwest Washington, D.C., this is the kind of food and nourishment that your mind gets. I absolutely love. I love this story. Tell us more about what's Jeremiah?
Jeremiah Banning.
Yeah.
Jeremiah Banning was a very interesting and prominent figure in, we should say, America, but to bring it local to Maryland and Easton and Talbot County in particular. He was commissioned by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson to lay out the town of Easton. And we have the actual certificates that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson signed to have him do that. So Easton has a Washington Street because of Jeremiah Banning and George Washington being close colleagues. Jeremiah Banning is this individual that I mentioned among many hats that he wore as slave master and surveyor, and the list went on and on and on, was a sea captain who also, as I mentioned, got on his ship and went over to Senegal, Africa, and got these 21 slaves and brought them back to Easton.
Right.
There was something very unusual about the relationship that he had with these 21 slaves in particular. The fact that he writes about all 21 of them, at least a page, their name, characteristics about them, and when he manumits them, he doesn't just do what some of the other slave masters do when they sign a manumission and emancipate them and you are hereby now free. He looks into their future. He deeds them property for what's known today as the Banning lots. And descendants from those Bannings, which he had named after himself, from that era of 1790 to 2013, continue to live on the Banning lots on the hill. Miss Rosalie Banning was 104 years old when she died in 2004, one of the descendants of the original Banning still living on the same property, for which the others still live there. So this is an amazing story, as I mentioned, not only just holding the distinction as America's oldest neighborhood, but also having the same people who have continuously inhabited that area, occupying that area today. So when you come down, you will see those same persons who have the same DNA from those that came from Senegal, Africa, that show up on the first United States federal census in America, and also live there today with the same built environment that reflects that. We don't find that kind of cultural landscape all throughout America. As I mentioned, there were neighborhoods that certainly predated this, so it's not the earliest. Right. But those neighborhoods have been obliterated. Those neighborhoods have been gentrified. We wouldn't be able to uncover the culture and history that we've been able to uncover and will continue to uncover for the next 5 years on the Hill.
Yeah. Let me ask, are you aware of any genealogy pursuits from those that we know that Banning brought over from Senegal? Has there been any trace back to their brothers and sisters in Senegal? Anything? Are we aware of that at all?
We're not aware of that. It's probably too early for me to share a real
no, it's not
groundbreaking.
It ain't too early.
But I will
come on with it.
I have a way of sharing it without sharing it, if you will.
Ain't nobody watching.
I shall say that a very noted Harvard University professor, who is probably the leading authority on African American genealogy, is extremely interested.
You talking about that one that police? I mean,
and personally working with us on this rich history, and has visited the area.
Right.
And soon, I believe, we will be able to answer those questions.
Well, I know you're not talking about Dr. Henry Louis Gates, but you're probably talking about somebody else. So maybe we can get him involved also. You think?
I think.
Okay. Man, this kind of work doesn't happen without some significant funding.
Yes.
how are we getting this done? What's
Sure.
what's the gas that going? How are we getting the gas that's going
Sure,
into
absolutely.
the tank?
Well, we have been successful in raising now nearly $400,000.
Okay.
Much of which has been through the support of philanthropic efforts locally there in Talbot County. However, other Marylanders have contributed financially to this project. The governor of the good state of Maryland has been very supportive of our project. We've received over $150,000 from the governor's commission. We've received monies from the National Trusts for Historic Preservation, and the list goes on and on and on. So between private dollars, state or federal dollars, local level foundations and what have you, they've all been very supportive. Volunteer efforts and hours from those that are in the community and beyond that are contributing to the project. And then the support of our various institutions. Morgan State University is leading this effort, but we're working with our sister institutions like the University of Maryland at College Park, and we're working with Salisbury University and the University of Maryland and Eastern Shore and Washington College and so forth. So it's a very large team composite for a very large, chapter of our history for which has been unwritten and undiscovered. So,
folks, we're being taught here today by Professor Dale Green, Professor. He's with Morgan State University, and as he said, the Architectural and Historic Preservation Unit. Where did you grow up?
In Easton, Maryland.
And when you were growing up in Easton, Maryland,
knew nothing about any of this. And coincidentally, my grandparents, who are in Easton, Maryland, and are 96 years old, never shared this until we started working on the project. And my grandparents have been married now for 73 years. And they mentioned 73 years ago, they were courting and dating each other on the Hill.
On the Hill.
So so again, it goes back to that. The from heres have always sort of known aspects of this history.
Right.
But it was just, this is what we did. Right. I met your grandfather on the Hill, but it's not a big deal.
So how did you become interested in this field of study?
Well, for me, as I say, I share often sometimes Sir Winston Churchill's quote on, "We shape our buildings and they thereafter shape us." I was always very interested in how America had been shaped from a built environment standpoint. And of course, the historic built environments were always of most interest to me in particular as an architect. And so my interest actually start obviously in this community and beyond, as I grew up on Maryland's Eastern Shore and was educated in the public school systems there and what have you. And then, of course, as I went on to undergraduate school and graduate school and what have you, I continued to further that interest and what have you. But the things that were around us in the physical environment, if you will, the built and natural environment, were the things that inspired me and motivated me. And so beyond art, architecture is considered often the mother art. It was that path that was really inspiring to me.
Let me ask you a question. Off subject a little bit, but I'm fascinated by all of this. I spoke this week with folks down in another part of Maryland. There's been a fascinating discovery of whale bones.
Yes.
They seem to have the entire whale. And the discovery of this whale on the cliffs of where Robert E. Lee resided, the way that they determine this is that it's somewhere that whale is 15 million years old.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with that. I have not been following that, but there are close ties to, if you will, the history of that whale, and similarly the history of this story in terms of preservation.
Yes.
In terms of how something like a whale that's 15 million years old or more can be uncovered in 2013 and still be so richly preserved that one could interpret, as they will go forward, not only what type of whale it is, but what that whale ate, where that whale came from. Right. Similarly, we are able to do the same things with this kind of historical and cultural aspect of our history. Mm-hmm. That's the beauty of science and technology coming together around the things that are seemingly just ordinary.
And what I'd like for you to do for me, and this just ain't just for the audience because I don't necessarily understand it either, Tell me about that. You'll get an artifact
Yes.
somewhere 6, 8, 12 inches beneath the soil.
Yes.
In the soil.
Yes.
You'll take that artifact and then do with it to determine what?
Sure. So let me share one of the most significant artifacts that had been uncovered in recent times as part of the archaeological excavation. There was a 1794 1-cent coin.
And this was at the hill.
This was on the hill.
On the hill. Mhm.
It's a very large coin to be 1 cent, but again, it goes back to 1794. And it's a liberty coin. It's a coin that symbolized freedom, and it comes from ancient Greece. And what was important about this coin, in particular to this neighborhood, was that it was found in the yard, in the excavations, of a house that was built in 1793.
Okay.
And the coin dates to 1794. But where the coin was found, because to sort of break down this archaeology, if you will, is that in that test pit, there are various layers. So as I mentioned, less than 6 inches below the earth or grade or the grass or what have you,
Right.
we can find these kind of artifacts. But we go down when persons would ask, how far do you go down? You go down until you don't find anything else. So that may be 3 feet, it could be 12 feet.
Right.
This particular coin was found approximately 18 inches below the grade.
Okay.
And there's a lot of big words. One's called stratigraphy, which essentially speaks to the integrity of the earth and the soil and how well it can preserve a particular artifact.
And that's stratigraphy?
Stratigraphy.
Okay. All right.
That 1794 coin was found in a layer that would have dated to 1810.
Okay.
So the question has to become, how does a 1794 coin that's so richly preserved, where the Liberty coin has Lady Liberty with a cap, and the cap would have had a red color, and that red color cap would have symbolized freedom. And they also would have wore a red gown. So during ancient Greece, if you were a free person, you wore a red gown and you wore a red cap to symbolize that you were a free person. So why was this coin found in this neighborhood when there were only about 44 of this particular coin ever made? And why was that coin found at a layer where in 1810, a 1794 1-cent coin would be so richly preserved and somebody still had it? Well, it symbolized the very core of this neighborhood. The very thing that we talked about earlier, the story of disbelief, an area tied to free blacks, not slaves. Because in local time, persons would say, oh, well, you know, there was a slave population in that neighborhood. There were some little cabins and what have you. Again, overlooking the stately federal period houses. Blacks could have never lived in those houses. And so at this federal
period... A failure to imagine.
Right. And so, you know, these things are being uncovered among several things at these various sites. And it's just extraordinary to be able to find and, as I mentioned, unearth aspects to go along with the historical documents that we have. Because in America, we believe if it's not written, it's not history. And when it is written, it is his story. And so it's important to understand that there is an American story that should reflect the Americans.
Yes. Professor Green, we've run out of time, unfortunately. But my absolute commitment to you and to those on the Hill is that we're going to stay with this story. Sure. And part of what I want to do with these cameras and this microphone is to further tell this story. And I really am committed to what I said earlier, and that is making some sort of arrangement with you and others who are involved in this project to come out to the Hill and to do a broadcast from the Hill, incorporating as many people from the descendants of the Hill as possible.
We welcome that.
Thanks so much for being on the Rock Newman Show.
It's the Rock Newman Show.